Jones. Okay. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining the session this afternoon. My name is Shannon Jones, and I will be moderating this session. And it's my pleasure to welcome our presenters from William and Mary Libraries today, and they will be presenting Creating a Neuro-Inclusive Workplace, Supporting Hiring Practices for Neurodiverse Candidates. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few logistical items with all of us. So this session is being recorded. Captions are available during the session by clicking the Live CC button on the bottom of your Zoom window. Thank you to my colleague Brittany Barnes for providing the closed captioning. Please use the Q&A feature for any presentation questions. You can choose to do this anonymously. There will be a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session at the end of the presentation today. In addition, we ask that you please use the chat for general comments or technical questions. My colleague Billy Cotterman will be monitoring the chat for any questions or comments. Billy will also be adding some links into the chat. One for the collaborative resource that we are sharing with participants. If you think of a related reading, a podcast, a video, or something else that you'd like to share, please share it in the chat box and we will add it to Comms resource Zotero. One of our volunteers will be dropping the information in the chat box. And the next link that you're going to see is the code of conduct that was shared and discussed in the opening session this morning. And now I will turn this session over to the presenters, and I will rejoin you at the end for the Q&A session. So I yield the floor to you all.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation entitled Creating a Neuro-Inclusive Workplace, Supportive Hiring Practices for Neurodiverse Candidates. We hope that this presentation will prove to be both enlightening and useful. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So to start things off, I wanted to introduce our research project team. As Shannon mentioned, our entire team is from William and Mary Libraries in Virginia, so that makes that part pretty simple. I'm James Glosson. I'm the Collections and Discovery Librarian. We also have Liz Bellamy, Instruction and Research Librarian, Alex Flores Glosson, Instruction and Research Librarian. Next slide. We also have Mary K. Oberlies, Instruction and Data Services Librarian, Michael Runyon, Digital Archivist, and Paul Showalter, Coordinator of Instruction and Assessment. Unfortunately, Paul won't be joining us today, but the rest of us are all in attendance and we'll be walking you through the rest of our presentation. So before we start, I also wanted to mention that our slides can be found at the link currently shown on the screen, both now and after our presentation. So if there's anything you want to go back and look at closer later, you'll be able to do so. And this link will be at the end of the presentation as well, so don't panic if you happen to miss it right now. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Michael, to get us started with some preliminary remarks.
Thank you, James. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you here today. I wanted us to start our presentation about our research with a statement about neurodiversity and neurodiversity self-advocacy. In the neurodiverse community, it's incredibly important to elevate the voices of neurodiverse self-advocates. That being people who they themselves have neurodiverse conditions, which may include autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit disorder, and many other conditions. In the course of conducting our research, we have been asked many times if we have anyone on our research team who is neurodivergent. Although not everybody on our team is comfortable self-disclosing, which is their right and their prerogative. I will note for myself, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder as a toddler. And our research from the beginning has been shaped by our team's experience of navigating the academic library job process. Our biggest hope for this kind of research is that we can tangibly help people that are like us, who have different working brains, and that our contributions can be valued in the way that they are supposed to be. And I'll hand this over to Liz to give us an overview of our presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Feel like we could have just left it there and kind of all gone on our way, because that's a total mic drop there. But to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about in this presentation today, because we are going to give you one, we're going to be talking about kind of the background of the study that kind of undergirds this presentation, how we designed that study, the best practices for neuro-inclusive hiring that we gleaned from our literature review, the findings of our study, some discussion of those findings, some recommendations for future considerations for future research, for future hiring. And I'll also say that we have given this talk in the past, a version of it in the past, and we learned so much from the participants. And we are going to give you a chance at the end to sort of give us your perspectives and your suggestions for, things that you have done to make your hiring process more inclusive for neurodiverse job candidates. So if you want to put those in the chat, feel free while we're going through our presentation, but you will also have a chance to share towards the end. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to James.
All right, thanks, Liz. So before we dive into our actual research, I wanted to share a little bit of background information on how this project came to be. So we can go ahead and hit the next slide. All right, so the inspiration for this study began with a conversation led by William and Mary's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee in the summer of 2022. The topic of this discussion was neurodiversity in the librarian profession. And specifically, the group was discussing an article from In the Library with a Lead Pipe, an open access, open peer-reviewed journal entitled Neurodiversity in the Library, One Librarian's Experience by Alice Ang. In the article, the author interviews Charlie Remy, an autistic electronic resources and serials librarian. And during the course of the interview, the two discussed the challenges that Charlie faced during the hiring process. And this exchange sparked further conversation on our end about the difficulties and challenges that are involved in the academic librarian hiring process. As many of us know, this process can often be quite rigorous, sometimes spanning more than one day and frequently featuring several meetings and interviews with various teams from the library, and perhaps even presentations to library or university staff. While this can be stressful for anybody, these situations can often prove to be particularly distressing for neurodivergent candidates, and we suspected that some of these hurdles might be discouraging neurodivergent individuals from entering the profession. Consequently, with fewer neurodiverse voices at the table, academic libraries will find it harder to identify the particular challenges that neurodiverse individuals face, as well as the accommodations that could aid in their recruitment, thus perpetuating a cycle of exclusion. So, in response to this dilemma, our team wanted to dig deeper into the topic of neurodiversity in relation to academic library hiring practices, and thus this project was born. We sought to achieve our study through a two-pronged approach. First, we performed a literature review of the existing research on the topic in order to identify examples of best practices. And then we gathered further insight via a survey that was sent out to several academic libraries across the United States in an attempt to gauge how frequently these best practices were being implemented. Next slide. So a couple other things to note before we move on. Number one, because neurodiversity can describe a wide range of neurological conditions, our study chose to focus particularly on autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, in order to help make our literature review and survey questions more focused and useful. We acknowledge that other neurological conditions may require different forms of accommodation, but we're also hopeful that many of the findings and best practices that we've pulled from our research will benefit candidates across the neurodiversity spectrum, as well as those who identify as neurotypical. Number two, unfortunately, we were unable to discover a lot of existing research specifically on the topic of neurodiversity in academic library hiring practices. We therefore found it necessary to extrapolate from works on disability and neurodiversity in both academia and librarianship more broadly to make sense of the existing literature while performing our literature review. And finally, we also wanted to give a shout out to another recent presentation that was hosted by ACERL on February 28th of this year. It was from the Library Accessibility Alliance and was entitled Transforming Librarianship to Model Neuro-Inclusion in Libraries. According to their own description, quote, "This session introduces participants to the neurodiversity employment movement and its impacts in other fields, such as IT. The presenters also share results from an IMLS-funded initiative that highlights the voices of neurodivergent librarians and their journey of negotiating identity as they face barriers and enablers to their success," end quote. In my opinion, this presentation provides a wonderful overview of the subject of neurodiversity and serves as a fantastic primer for anybody who is starting to explore the topic. I highly recommend checking it out as it goes in much more depth into the basic definitions and concepts related to neurodiversity, which we're not going to be covering as deeply in our conversation today. And with that, we'll now be diving into our own research. So I'm going to pass the baton back to my colleague, Liz, who will be discussing the details of our survey design and methodology.
Yeah, thanks, James. So I'll briefly go into kind of how we designed our survey. So we can go to our next slide. Thanks. So the big question that we had with this study was, to what extent are academic libraries incorporating best practices in their hiring processes that are inclusive to neurodiverse candidates, right? And we didn't want to be the ones to set the standard of what a best practice is. We're not necessarily content experts in the arena. We have personal experiences. We have some knowledge about some of the common practices that have kind of started filtering into our profession, like giving interview questions in advance, not requiring cameras to be on during Zoom interviews. In some cases, kind of radical concepts like GASP not requiring people who aren't going to be presenting regularly in their job to give that big formal job talk. But we figured there were lots of practices that we weren't aware of. So we did a pretty thorough literature review. And we found 3 sources. As James had mentioned, we weren't able to find anything within library literature itself, but we were able to find these 3 sources that were largely from human resources studies and also disability studies. And these sources all looked at various aspects of the employment or hiring process from the perspective of either employers or autistic job seekers. And you can find all of these in our works cited page that you can find in our at the end of our slides. Yeah, so it was interesting for me to note that in our whole scouring of the literature, we were only able to find 3. They were all published in the last few years. So this is a really emerging field. Something that we also saw a lot in the literature review were very real complaints by librarians that the literature in librarianship tends to focus on autistic library patrons rather than autistic library workers or other neurodivergent library workers. And so we're pretty proud that we're able to kind of not start the conversation, but to, have a voice in this very emerging conversation in our field. We're really excited to see that other library folks are also doing work in this, like the webinar that James had mentioned and other studies that we've seen. So this is the very beginning, but we had to start somewhere. So we went to these 3 sources to sort of give us some best practices to work with. And I should also say that Mary is going to go into those best practices right after I stop talking. So we will definitely go more into depth in that in a second. Then in creating the survey, we've also wanted to know to what extent these practices are being used. So is anyone using them in the first place? And if they are, how often are these best practices being implemented? So we wanted to know, are people using them by default? Is it something that is used sporadically, whether, one department tends to employ these practices and one doesn't, or it's kind of job dependent, or it's just sort of like at a whim? Or is it a practice that library hiring committees employ by request, which, obviously has its own problems when, you are a person in a precarious position of trying to be hired, and you have to be the one to request these accommodations. We also had a hypothesis about some maybe public institutions might have a little bit more leeway, or maybe private institutions, either way, in being able to kind of implement these practices. So we also asked our survey participants about that. And then we also wanted to know if there were any practices that we weren't aware of that hadn't been discussed in the literature that libraries were undertaking in their hiring processes. So we created the survey, and then we had to find our participants. And we went to the higher ed jobs website and culled anyone posting a full-time position anywhere from July of 2021 to October 1st of 2022. So it was a wide array of possible participants. And we targeted search committee chairs, library directors if need be, or folks in charge of HR at libraries to send the survey out. And in total, we sent the survey to 369 different libraries. And so Mary's going to talk about those best practices.
Okay, so we've already noted that in reviewing the best practices for hiring neurodiverse candidates, there's limited literature within librarianship, so we definitely looked at academia generally, as well as HR. From this, we identified 3 broad categories of best practices. So those are the job descriptions, interview practices, and training on neurodiversity. I'm going to go into more detail with each of these, but just to give you a broad idea, we're looking for job descriptions that use inclusive language and are clear, direct, and skills-based. Interview practices include limiting schedules to only essential elements and providing candidates with advance notice of the schedule, what questions you're going to be asking, and any kind of expectations you have of the candidate in terms of their behavior and how they dress. And finally, to be more inclusive, people training on neurodiversity. So I'll mention here that we actually have these 3 broad categories, but we distilled them down to a total of 21 best practices. For consideration of time, we can't have the whole presentation be on this. What we have done is, instead of me going into each one of these 21 practices, we've added them as an appendix of sorts to the end of this presentation, so everyone will have access to them. Okay. So job descriptions, I mentioned that they need to be clear, direct, and skills-based. But to be more specific, we need to examine each of the elements within the job description, focusing in on what we're including and how we phrase what is listed. So many of us have probably seen enough job descriptions to know that we have some copy and paste elements. We just carry them over from job description to job description. Working well in a team is a fantastic example of this. These generic requirements aren't actually always necessary for every single position within the library. So as you revise, you should determine exactly what the candidate will be doing in their job, and then review and edit the description to list out only those essential skills. This is also true for our tendency towards ambiguous language within our job descriptions. So think here of, we like to say that we're looking for a self-driven employee, but what does that actually mean? So usually we're just looking for somebody who works well with limited direct supervision. So instead of just saying self-driven, let's be upfront and say what we actually mean, because just saying self-driven, it leaves a lot open for interpretation. Overall, the goal is to avoid overloading a job description with unnecessary information and needless criteria. By creating job descriptions that are inclusive, that are short, are skills focused, and also note that people should apply even if they're missing preferred qualifications, and that you're going to provide training and support to hired individuals so that they can exceed, all demonstrate that you are committed to inclusive hiring and also signal that your library is a welcoming environment to neurodiverse candidates. Next slide. Okay. So interview practices. These encompass everything from the questions you draft to how you actually set up your interview sessions for the phone, a virtual interview, or in-person interviews. So let's talk about questions first. Just like with our job descriptions, we want them to be equally clear and unambiguous as possible. You need to avoid hypothetical situations, personality questions, and forced recall questions because they actually put candidates at a disadvantage. We often think that these are amazing questions to help us learn a lot about a candidate, or that we're inviting them to share information about themselves and their breadth of knowledge, but in all actuality, they're very ableist. So you might be saying, how is that ableist? Well, it can lead neurodiverse individuals may have to interpret those questions, and they might interpret them literally, or if you've given them a hypothetical situation, for example, describe a time you had a conflict with a colleague, they may not actually be able to recall an answer due to differences in social skills or how they read behavior of others. This can result in candidates needing to fake their answers to mimic neurotypical behavior, or they might provide responses that the search committee is going to just deem incorrect or wrong. If for some reason you can't get around asking open-ended questions, then you want to actually make sure that they're just direct and specific. So for example, tell us about the communication skills you use in your current position. So it's more open, but it is very specific as to what you're looking for the individual to provide you information about. So in addition to adjusting the questions you ask, you should also share questions in advance of the interviews. And in advance means more than one day. Give them at least 3 days at minimum, if not more. This will allow your candidates to provide more thoughtful answers and provide you better insight into their experiences. Finally, when it comes time for the interview to take place, we really should limit how many people actually participate. So as humanly possible, limit or avoid group interviews and excessively large search committees because those often overwhelm candidates. Okay, so final part of interview practices, because it encompasses a lot, is focusing on the schedules themselves. Who here has been through a terrible interview day or days of scheduling? I'm sure, yep, every single one of us has at least one terrible story that we can tell. When it comes to formatting our interviews, there are several best practices to keep in mind. First and foremost, actually providing the candidate with a schedule of the day in advance. It should include what's happening, where, when, for how long, and with who they are meeting with. Including information about expectations regarding dress and other behavioral expectations you have of the candidate is also very helpful. Now, I get pushback on this, and I totally get that because you shouldn't have to tell people how to dress and behave. However, if your search committee is going to be evaluating somebody on that, then you need to let them know in advance. Through the schedule, for each room that you're taking the candidate into, whether they're going to be meeting with people or presenting in it, plan to introduce them to that space ahead of time so that they get a sense of it. So they have a chance to move around within it and also get a chance to work with the technology and know what they can work with. Offer to make changes for them. Don't wait for them to ask for that. So that can include providing them with the option to sit or stand, providing microphones, which we should just provide microphones, and so forth. And then as you're moving from space to space or from campus building to campus building, you also want to provide the candidate with options of how they travel. Don't wait for them to request it. Again, just say, hey, we're going to be walking about 10 to 15 minutes. Would you prefer to drive instead of walk? Or we can either take an elevator or the stairs. Do you have a preference? If you can provide alternatives as well to the standard interview practices, so Liz mentioned earlier, the presentation of all things that we love and think about. Another example is group role playing. Consider whether or not the skills you need the candidate to actually demonstrate are essential. So if they are not going to be in some kind of position where they're going to be teaching or presenting to people or having to have a lot of communication with the public, then maybe they don't actually have to do a presentation. Instead, maybe they can demonstrate their skills a different way. We need to overcome our tendency toward keeping things around because it's what we've always done, or even worse, because they made me do it, which I have heard at an interview before. Lastly, and ever so important, is to build in breaks for your candidates. They deserve time to have mental rest and use the restroom and have a snack and drink some water all by themselves. Okay, now I'm ready for the next slide, Alex. Okay, last but not least, training on neurodiversity. So, seeking and providing training on neurodiversity and disability to hiring committees, to supervisors, and administrators is all an essential part of redesigning the recruitment and hiring process to actually make it neuro-inclusive. Training on it actually helps with unconscious bias and stereotyping. And let's be totally brutally honest here, it's impossible to actually tackle unconscious bias and stereotyping if you do not have help. And by failing to include this training, even if you adjust those job descriptions and adjust the interview practices like I mentioned, you still run the risk of continuing to evaluate your candidates for what people would describe as job fit or proper social presentation. This training also is going to help you address complaints from people about unfair advantages of providing people with accessibility, because then we all now are become knowledgeable and understand why inclusive practices should actually be everyday practices. As I wrap this up, I just want to remind you, all 21 are listed at the very end of this presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and Alex to talk about our findings.
Thank you, Mary. I really appreciated you going over those best practices with our audience. So I just want to give a quick disclaimer about our findings before we delve into this discussion. So as is not uncommon in our field, we had a fairly low response rate to our survey that we sent out. We sent out the survey for our study to 369 libraries, I believe is what was said. And we only received 51 responses. For people who are doing better at doing statistics off the top of their head than I am, you might be able to figure out that this might lead to our results not being statistically significant, and you would be correct. However, we still find that our results are interesting and noteworthy, and we think that the results are still a valuable place to start and continue the scholarly conversation on this topic. And hopefully down the line, we can have some more statistically significant findings as this field gets more attention and research. So that being said, with the results that we did receive for our study, the results, frankly, were not very promising. There seemed to be few areas where academic libraries were excelling for neuro-inclusive hiring. Many of the best practices that were outlined in the survey were barely used by the libraries that were surveyed, and the ones that were not utilized consistently the majority of the time. We sum it up this way: where libraries are the strongest, they're still not that strong, and where they're weak, they're very, very weak. So what are some best practices that libraries were using the most according to our survey? Here are 3 examples of practices that were being heavily utilized by the libraries we surveyed. Many of these: writing job ads to be as clear as possible, creating a deliberately quiet and unrushed environment during the interview process, providing information about how to request accommodations, may seem to be low-hanging fruit, and comparatively they are. We also, in our opinion, as a research team, we find these to be fairly easy to implement, and also many of them benefit neurotypical people as well. What are some of the best practices that the libraries we surveyed weren't using as much? These are a few of those best practices. So utilizing autism or disability-focused hiring networks was underutilized, as well as providing training on neurodiversity and how to support it during the hiring process or through an HR process. Using direct and inclusive language about hiring neurodiverse individuals in job postings, and keeping the number of interviewers to 1 or 2 people maximum per session. So we did want to note here for the keeping the number of interviewers to 1 or 2 people maximum per session. We realized after we sent out this study that this is rather difficult to implement within an academic library setting, especially for the need for hiring committees. However, we would like to see the goal as being to avoid search committee bloat. Try to keep the size of your search committees smaller, and especially the number of people that are involved in each interview session small. Think about who's essential to have for each session. What's the maximum people you need to run a fair hiring process for? However, we were very troubled by how few libraries were providing neurodiversity training for hiring contexts, and we do worry about the lack of that training leading to implicit bias. And I'll hand this off to Alex to continue the discussion of our findings.
Thanks so much, Michael. So just because a library says that it's using a best practice, that doesn't mean that they're using it by default. And in fact, we found a wide variety in how frequently these best practices were being employed. And of course, as researchers, we would argue any use other than by default is adding undue burden onto all of your candidates, particularly neurodiverse candidates. So these are just a few of the examples of which best practices are being used most often by default. Most of them hover around 50%, maybe a little bit higher, but we still believe that we're dealing with the low-hanging fruit here. So just as an example, introducing the presentation room prior to the presentation, 51% of our survey respondents said that they do that by default, which sounds great, right? But then when you think about it, the reality is that 48% of our survey respondents don't do this by default. So it's up to the candidate to either ask for this or to just go at a disadvantage. In the same vein, which best practices are rarely used by default? Here are some of the examples of our least used best practices. The one that we're going to highlight, Michael highlighted it, and I believe Mary highlighted it. I think all of us are going to highlight it. It is this provided training on neurodiversity and how to support it in hiring to HR professionals and hiring managers prior to conducting an interview. Only 2% of our survey respondents said that they do this practice by default. So you can see how that would be a little bit problematic. We think that the data paints a rather stark picture of the status quo in libraries with regard to making the job process inclusive and accommodating to neurodiverse folks. If we look at the data, it tells us that we have significant work left to do in this field. Now that we've shared some of our findings, it's time to explore a little bit their implications. So we've reiterated a few different times in a few different ways, but it cannot be understated that although the practices highlighted in this study can benefit a broad spectrum of candidates, we need to acknowledge that addressing all the varied needs of job seekers requires more than just a single set of guidelines. Encouraging a supportive community where individuals don't feel compelled to mask their identities to fit in and are safe to disclose their disabilities without fear of negative repercussions is key to providing folks the support they need to navigate the job search successfully. However, we don't live in a vacuum where we can change systemic inequalities instantaneously with good vibes only. So having a set of best practices to guide our hiring processes is a great place to start. Moreover, universal design benefits all, including undiagnosed individuals, which from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective is a critical point, given the rates of underdiagnosis in marginalized populations, such as those assigned female at birth and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So, are academic libraries creating neuro-inclusive workplaces? Not really. It's crucial to recognize that according to our survey, the current efforts to employ the best practices when it comes to hiring in LIS often target only the most readily accessible strategies, the proverbial low-hanging fruit when it comes to accommodating neurodiverse job candidates. Although taking these initial steps is a positive move forward, to pull directly from our results, it's concerning that less than 3% of our respondents automatically provide training on neurodiversity and how to support it to LIS HR professionals and hiring managers before they conduct the interviews. Y'all, that's bananas. To truly foster an inclusive environment and provide equitable opportunity, we must challenge ourselves to move beyond these surface level approaches. Merely addressing the obvious aspects of accommodation is not sufficient. As a reminder, ADA requirements are the bare minimum bar to strive for, and only trying to meet them is still very exclusionary. But more broadly, the lack of survey participation poses a significant issue, particularly when juxtaposed with the stated commitment of libraries to inclusivity. This disconnect between professed values and actual practices underscores the importance of robust data collection to accurately assess the degree of inclusivity within library hiring processes, aka go do the survey sitting in your email inbox. I'm talking to you, Alex Flores Glosson. The profession needs it. But don't worry, this isn't where we're going to leave you. Maybe. The silver lining is that in our research, we've uncovered a clear and compelling desire among those we surveyed for inclusivity in the hiring process within the LIS field. As for the disparity between the aspirations for inclusivity and the actual integration of these principles, we can hypothesize that resource constraints, time, money, staff, you know, the thing that libraries are notorious for having an overabundance of, and institutional HR red tape would be among the top things that stand in the way of translating intentions into actions. All in all, while good intentions lay the groundwork, words without actions hold no weight, and there is considerable work to still be done. I'm going to throw it back over to Michael now to talk about the recommendations for future research.
Thank you, Alex. So in the course of conducting this study, our team was just filled and buzzing with ideas, both as soon as we sent out our survey and as we were going through our survey results. And we've identified a few areas that we think would be really fruitful future avenues of research to continue this conversation. So we'd like to go over a few of those. Firstly, I'd like to address how can we measure impacts of best practices? Which best practices are best supporting our neurodivergent job candidates and or librarians? Because we can also think beyond the hiring process and also to the experience of neurodiverse people working in academic library settings. We were also curious to see what factors might impact the implementation of best practices, what institutional demographics could play a role. A few demographics we thought might play a role in how neurodiverse job candidates are treated is the size of academic institution, its location, the size of the academic library or library system that is doing the hiring, may or may not have an impact on how accommodations are provided to neurodiverse job candidates. We also thought it might be fruitful to flip the process, so to speak, and to look from the perspective of neurodiverse job seekers in academic library settings. What do they identify as their personal challenges in the hiring process? We have a little bit of that insight being comprised of various neurodivergent folks on our team, but having a study explicitly from that perspective could be really fruitful. Lastly, looking at the retention of neurodiverse library workers and how the tenure process for neurodiverse librarians and archivists might be impacting both the experience of those workers and their retention, their longevity in their positions. And I believe I'm passing it off to Liz to kind of lead a little bit of discussion with our audience.
Yeah, so that is sort of the end of our formal presentation. We will absolutely be taking questions, but before we get to that, like I had said at the beginning, we learned so much from the last time we did a variation of this presentation. from the people who had attended our session. So we want to give you all a chance to kind of share your perspectives and share your suggestions for other people who, want to be more inclusive of neurodivergent individuals when going through the hiring process. So we have this Padlet that Alex has up on our screen right now. We have a link to the Padlet in our slides and also in the chat. So we're going to be taking questions in just a minute, but while we're kind of doing that, we thought that we'd give you all a chance to kind of chime in the background. So on the left side, left column, you can tell us if you have experiences to share about neuro-inclusive hiring, whether that's or not inclusive hiring, whether you are a neurodivergent job seeker, or you've been one, whether you're someone on a search committee in whatever capacity, or generally if you're just an ally. You can also tell us what hiring practices you've used, or what hiring practices do you think we could use that maybe we didn't touch on that can create a neuro-inclusive workplace. And then we're going to be heading over to our questions. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. Hope this was informative, and we're really excited to hear what questions you have for us all.
Excellent. Well, first of all, kudos on an excellent presentation. And I can tell from the chat box that people are really engaged and connected with your topic. And so we have two questions in the chat box so far. The first one is from Becca Yowler, and it asks, can you share more about autism or disability-focused hiring networks? Is there a list of these somewhere?
I'd be willing to chime in about that one. So I think this might have actually come from a recommendation we saw. We also reviewed literature from the IT field, looking at neurodiversity in IT. As a digital archivist, I have often found that with more technical roles in libraries, there can be a lot of overlap between sort of job seeking skills in that way with also the IT field. So I think there aren't necessarily a lot of neurodiverse hiring networks for libraries specifically yet, but I'll link in the Q&A box. There are a few that have kind of started to become more popular in tech, and I think are maybe making their way over to academic settings as well, based on what I've seen a little bit in these websites. So.
Okay, thank you. And someone did put a link under that question in the chat box if you want to take a look at that. And then so the next question is from Paul Glassman, and it says, very clear and thorough. Thank you. With so much emphasis on identifying emotional intelligence in candidates for certain positions, is there a way to resolve or reconcile that need in certain positions without risking bias toward neurodiverse candidates in the interview and hiring process?
I can start off with this. Just one thought I had. I think this is an opportunity for you to really make use of providing training and support for candidates. So one of the things I mentioned during the best practices is that that's one thing that you can include in your job descriptions, is to say, hey, if you don't have all these things, we're going to train you on it. And so I think that one way you can actually like reconcile this need for emotional intelligence or something like that is to say, hey, even if we don't have these skills yet, we're going to work with you on gaining those skills. And I think that would be one way to go forward, is to just plan on actually putting in the work and professional development and things like that with your employees, instead of just assuming that they're coming to you as a fully, I'm ready to just do everything kind of person, which those unicorns, they don't actually exist.
Okay, thank you. And so those were the two questions that we had. And Paul said that those great ideas and answers. So thank you for that. If anyone else has a question, we have a little more time in the session, and we do welcome any additional questions anyone may have. And so we'll give you another couple seconds to type in the chat box before we close out the session.
And while people are thinking, we could also go back to our Padlet. Alex, are you still able to share the screen? Yeah, so we can, we've gotten a few responses on the Padlet. So some perspectives for prospective employers. Let's see, I think so someone said the biggest thing for me is written questions ahead of time. Yeah, absolutely. It's really helpful as an accessibility tool. Another person wrote about interview questions, that they should be kept simple and stay away from multi-part questions. That is also great advice. Job qualifications, stay away from personality traits as requirements and focus on job needs. Getting questions in advance is so important. If unwilling to do that, paste them into the chat or provide a handout at the top of the interview session. And breaks are incredibly important too. Yeah, those are all really great perspectives. Some suggestions on the other side. Giving candidates a choice about having lunch by themselves. Oh, that's interesting. We provide the food and they get to spend 45 minutes or so on their own, or having lunch with a few folks from the library. Great option for extroverts. I love that idea of giving choice. Candidates have said that they greatly appreciated this option, and we made it clear that there was no right answer. And it looks like CORE has best practices for academic interviews, and they say that questions in advance, shorter interview days, presentations that are very concrete, like show and tell something you've done for non-teaching roles, are all suggestions, which I didn't know those best practices existed. So that's really, really good to know about for folks who didn't.
Okay, and we do have a few more questions that have come in. So thank you for reviewing your Padlet information. It gave people some opportunity to think of what they wanted for their question. So the first question is, as someone who is autistic, how can I help my colleagues understand the struggles I have with day-to-day social situations and in group meetings and group lunches when training isn't given to the group?
I'm happy to take this question because this is something I've had as an issue throughout my entire career as a professional librarian. Unfortunately, a lot of people still don't know a lot about what neurodiversity looks like. And I will find, as someone who has low external support needs, my colleagues often are not aware of how my autism might be impacting me in the workplace. Especially because I mask, which is a term I don't think we covered in this presentation, but a way for neurodivergent people to act and appease neurotypical people more in public spaces. I think if you are fortunate enough to have work colleagues that are empathetic and maybe just are lacking the knowledge, it's worth having a conversation with some folks and say, I'm having a hard time understanding how to address this or how to get around this requirement. If it is a requirement, it's definitely beneficial also to set boundaries and find peace, which is also the title of a book that I absolutely love and wish everybody could read in every context. Having really good professional boundaries is helpful. I have made it very clear to my department that I need a lot of alone time and deep focus time in order to best do my work. And if I'm constantly being asked to be on call to answer questions, that is not conducive to how I work. So it's a multi-pronged approach, and there's not really a clear-cut answer, but I hope some of that at least was helpful.
I think it also highlights the need for, folks who aren't for, neurotypical folks to also advocate for, general library trainings on accessibility, on autism, on neurodiversity. like James said at the very beginning, this whole research study was sparked by a conversation that we had in our library through our library's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee on this topic. I think it's really important for everyone to have a baseline knowledge, if not more than that, ideally more than that. Yeah, it's really tough when, you know, people in your library don't know about neurodiversity and don't know, you know, how different people's brains work differently. So, you know, talking with people who are allies or seem like they could be allies and suggesting maybe some more general trainings or more general professional development opportunities might also be something.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a few more. This person, Mary Miller, says, I'm interested if any of the presenters or attendees have any recommendations to incorporate for the onboarding process after hiring.
So we did a little bit of looking at the retention element when we were doing our literature review. And I 1000% agree with Becca about actually scheduling breaks. Oh my gosh, please schedule breaks because it's too intensive for you to just go from session to session to session or like from one office to another office and so forth. You don't remember anything anyway when you do that kind of thing. But I think that there is a big opportunity for during the onboarding process for hiring managers, for whoever the supervisor is, to be very clear and honest with new employees. And this is putting work on the managers to actually be truthful when they offer this, is to be like, hey, if you don't understand something, ask for the clarification. If I'm telling you something and you're like, I don't agree with this or whatever, like actually being like, I am very welcome to this open, honest communication. If we need to clarify things, we'll clarify things. If things aren't working, we'll fix them and so forth. And that's 1000% on managers and libraries also to actually be authentic about that support. So I think that needs to be part of the onboarding process. The other elements would be, I've been onboarded to plenty of libraries now, where it's scattershot, right? So actually having a plan for how you are going to onboard people and sharing that plan with them is a big thing. And I also would encourage to not be like, you need to contact this person, this person, this person. Actually make those contacts for people. It doesn't have to be, I'm going to take you to their office and tell you how to talk to them or anything. It can be like, hey, I'm going to do the introductory email, that kind of thing. And tell them why they're meeting with them. I had a lot of like meetings with people. I'd be like, I don't actually know why I'm meeting with you, but you were on the list. So having the actual schedule of these are the things you need to do, these are the people you need to talk to, this is how we're working with them, then helping actually make those connections would be a really powerful way of actually supporting people with the onboarding process after hiring.
Okay, thank you. We have another one, and I'll do a time check after this next question. It says, I was taken aback by not offering open questions. Would you say that this is something we should consider for managerial or higher level positions where the candidate will need to think on their feet, so to speak, as part of the job?
I'm going to be radical here and say, should we not force people to think on their feet? And should we instead encourage people to actually be reflective? So, I mean, you can still do the open questions. I think that they still need to be very clear and actually. So I gave an example of an open question being like, hey, share the communication skills on this. And so then you also have the hypothetical open questions, which I'm thinking is probably more like what you're talking about because of the higher level individuals. But I think that we should still really like push back on thinking on their feet and instead push reflective thinking. And maybe that is partly giving these people questions in advance so that they do have a chance to like think through this. Because like if you're doing true thinking on your feet, then you're also just throwing this crazy question at them without any kind of warning. But that's my opinion about thinking on your feet.
And that goes back to the keynote too, right? About how, you know, our culture is that we've adopted weirdly from corporate culture is that everything has to be right away, right? And so metrics based. So yeah, Mary, I think that's a great response.
Okay, we'll go on. I'm sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, as a autistic person that was going through the academic library process, hiring process, having questions ahead of time and not being forced to think on my feet, actually enabled me to shine and have a lot more success. I was able to prepare. I wrote basically an essay ahead of time. Alex was on my hiring committee, she knows. And I was able to give a lot more reflective and substantial answers to a lot of the questions, especially ones that maybe required research to give a good answer. And I think that there's a lot of like a false sense of urgency in American working culture as a whole. And I think libraries are not immune to that. And we should really push back against that and say, actually, to do quality work, not everything can be under this false sense of urgency. So,
Just to piggyback off of Michael, I think as people on search committees too, we don't want we don't want to give gotchas to our candidates, right? You know, we want the best person for the job. I want to see how you can actually do that job. I don't want to throw a monkey wrench and see you get panicked on your feet. What is that? That doesn't benefit me at all. It doesn't benefit you at all. So it's really just reshaping how we're looking at interviews. This is going to be both of us treating each other like humans so we can do a job and feed our families and live in this capitalistic society that we live in. You know, we're not here to like, gotcha, you know, it's just reframing.
Okay, thank you all for that response. And I think we can do one last question, and I will go with the next one. What does neurodiversity training look like? What elements should be included? Are there existing trainings, i.e., webinars, workshops, curricula that you all would recommend?
so I'd be happy to tackle this as well. So, similar to racial bias training, there are increasingly more neurodiversity inclusive trainings out there for various different HR settings. I actually just looked, and University of Wisconsin-Madison has a really great continuing education program for librarians post-master's degree. I took a couple of their classes on cataloging and things like that when I finished my MSLS. And I see they actually have a training on workplace neurodiversity, creating spaces where all minds can thrive. And this is just one of a few different trainings I was able to see pretty quickly with a few Google searches. So I think the resources have started to become more available and they are getting out there. I will also say at William and Mary, we personally have a professor who is neurodivergent himself and he provides on-campus training. And so it might not necessarily be library specific, but you might be able to like, tap into other campus resources as well for that kind of training.
And I'll just add on to that, wherever possible, I would recommend getting advice, getting training from people who have who are neurodivergent, if possible, or who have worked extensively with neurodivergent people. I think there are a couple of organizations that we could offline recommend you stay away from. So yeah, that's just another thing to keep in mind.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for your thoughtful presentation and for your thoughtful answers to the questions that were posed. We actually got to as many questions as we actually could. So so thank you all for that. I also want to thank you all in the audience for attending. And so you know, no presentation without an audience. So thank you all for showing up today. So before we close out, I do want to point out that there's an evaluation survey that's available for you to complete for this session. I'm almost positive that our presenters would be appreciative to hear your feedback. You'll find the link if you log back into Sketch for this particular session is labeled feedback survey, and it is sitting directly above the session description. I am also hopeful that if your question did not get answered, that our presenters would welcome your question to them via their contact information. It was on their last slide. And so again, thank you all for attending, and we hope you really enjoyed the session. And I'll ask the presenters if you all could put your link to your presentation in, again, in case there were people who joined later, and that way they can get your contact information. But you all have a great afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the conference today, and we will see you at the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon.
You're welcome. Thank you all. That was an amazing presentation. I was jotting down notes, but also trying to think through what our interview processes look like. So I will be going back revisiting your slides for sure.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, y'all too.